Resident Evil 5 is an interesting entry for the series in my opinion, riding off of the success that was Resident Evil 4 whilst also deviating even further from the series' survival horror roots by including more of what made Resident Evil 4 so great, and then some. Some people might feel as though this is one of the best Resident Evils within the entire series, while others may claim that it's one of the worst. With that in mind, let's get into the review and see if Resident Evil 5 is worth picking up. Resident Evil 5's main story begins with series protagonist Chris Redfield on his way to the fictional region of Kijuju to meet up with the West African branch of the BSAA, an anti-bioterrorism unit formed to prevent incidents similar to Raccoon City, as well as assisting stabilizing regions that are impacted by bioterrorism. On his way there, Chris is accompanied by his new partner Sheva Almore, a West African BSAA operative. The two fight their way through hordes of newly infected Las Plagas hosts known as Magini to uncover secrets of a newly developed bioweapon known as Ouroboros. The story takes lots of twists and turns, and for the sake of players who have not played 5 yet, I'll try to refrain from spoiling as much as possible. But before I get into my extended thoughts on the story, I should probably give those people a chance to skip ahead if they haven't played Resident Evil 5 before, to just listen to my thoughts on the gameplay. So for those of you that don't want to get spoiled, you can go ahead and skip ahead to whatever timestamp I've put up on screen. This can also apply to anybody that just does not want to hear my thoughts on the story and just wants to get straight into the gameplay. But that being said, the timestamp should be right there on screen for you. Now that those people have skipped ahead, let's get into my extended thoughts on the story. When I initially played this game back in 2009, I really wasn't that invested into the series at that point. I didn't really know what to think of it, and believe it or not, there was a point in time where I actually didn't think that this game's story was that good. But as I've gotten older and the more time I put into playing this game, I've actually grown to appreciate it more. Like a lot more. See, unlike Resident Evil 4, 5 has a lot more effort in trying to keep the story as close as what Resident Evil should be. What I mean is there's no paranormal aspects to the game, such as having characters being controlled by an old guy who raises his hand, or having ancient doors being opened by ancient lasers. Granted, there's a segment in the game where you have to avoid being killed by a sunbeam, and you have to do that while going through some various ruins, but honestly, I can actually let that slide because in comparison to Resident Evil 4, this isn't really something that's done a whole lot in Resident Evil 5. In fact, I think that's the only segment in the game where you really have to deal with something that's very paranormal. Outside of that, everything else is more or less trying to be realistic as possible, and I quite prefer that method as opposed to having various paranormal aspects to the game. That's something that just feels closer to what Resident Evil should be. And that being said, the focus of Resident Evil 5 happens to deal more so with bioorganic weapons, along with concluding Chris's fight with Wesker and anything really related to Umbrella. It doesn't really feel like a standalone story just because Capcom deemed it so, and in my opinion, I feel as though 5 could have been a great way to conclude the story for 2 of the 4 remaining STARS members. In fact, during the concept phase, Capcom did originally intend to have all of the remaining STARS members return. The idea was to originally have Chris's partner characters be swapped out as the story progressed. That's of course another topic for another video, but the point still remains that 5's story did seem like it was originally meant to conclude a story that goes all the way back to the original game. You know, generally speaking, I don't tend to talk about story aspects in my reviews. I generally try to keep things focused primarily on gameplay, but in this case I think I can make an exception and possibly even a standard for future reviews that I work on. But back on topic, the more serious tone of the story does make things more interesting, while maintaining a few moments that still seem to have that Resident Evil style of cheesiness that you would come to expect from the series. Not to sound like a broken record, but it honestly would have been a great way to conclude the story, or at the very least conclude it for Chris. Aside from that, one of my favorite aspects of this game is just the simple fact that we finally get to see another corporation similar to Umbrella Trycell be involved in the story. Say what you will about it, but I actually think it's a nice change of pace from seeing Umbrella having some direct involvement within the series lore. I mean, it's better than having a bunch of cultists planning world domination from a small remote Spanish island, in my personal opinion. Also, I don't mean to bring this back on the subject of partners, but I don't want to make it seem like I'm disregarding the other characters. For starters, Sheva is meant to be a sort of replacement partner for Chris, mostly to delve into the backstory of how he's still traumatized by the events of Lost in Nightmares, where he thought Jill was dead. I think that Sheva is actually not that bad of a character. It's just really unfortunate that her AI is just not that bright. If anything though, I'd actually really like for her to return in maybe the Revelation series or a new sequel, if not another spin-off that is similar to Revelations, just really anything to give her a second chance. Of course, there's also Josh and Jill, but I'll save those two for later when we get into talking about the DLC. They're mostly prominent in those chapters, although I will say that the small amount of involvement that they have in the main story was good. I just wish we had more interaction with them as opposed to the DLC. Again, I will talk about more of that later. Then we have our villains, and this is where I will actually make a complaint about this game. The villains are mostly bland with the exception of Wesker. I mean, you have Irving, who's more or less a discount Salazar from Resident Evil 4, with really the only difference being that he isn't a half-pint midget, and his goals for serving the main antagonist differs from an old man claiming to be in his 20s. Also, just the fact that he's a businessman with standards, or so he claims. Irving's followed up by Ace Thought Excella, whose key motivation for doing evil shit is to try to get Wesker's dick. Obviously, there's more to it than that when it comes to this character, but that's the one thing that this game's story makes clear when you first see her, and that is, she's an utter thought. But to be quite frank, the transition from Irving to this character isn't as good as going from, like, say, Salazar to Krauser like in Resident Evil 4. I guess mostly my issue stems with the fact that we don't get to see a character who's just as skilled as our two heroes, with possibly some history with them, at least one of them. Although I guess you wouldn't want a repeat of having a boss that could be defeated with a knife, so I guess that might be the reason why, who knows. Lastly, we have Wesker, and while I think his portrayal lines up with previous iterations, I do have one complaint, and that's with the voice acting. Now, this isn't to downplay DC Douglas as an actor, even though I dislike him as a person and disagree with his political beliefs, but in my humble opinion, he's just not the best fit for Wesker. You could see this as nitpicking, but as far as I'm concerned, I just don't feel as though it makes sense for Wesker to sound British or have a British sounding accent. Granted, he isn't the first voice actor to do it, but I do think that his take in particular was really pushing it a little bit too much. Although that said, I do think that DC Douglas did do a good job with what he had to work with. I'll also say for the people that may have enjoyed Wesker's portrayal in Code Veronica, they might feel right at home given that this iteration of Wesker feels a lot like Code Veronica's, just cranked up to 11, and maybe throwing a bit of Devil May Cry's Virgil. However, I'm not here to just talk about the game's story, so let's get right into the gameplay of Resident Evil 5. Essentially, Resident Evil 5 takes what made Resident Evil 4's combat so good and just builds and improves upon it. For starters, there's an actual strafing animation, so rather than just having tank-like movement with the ability to really just only walk forward or backwards, you're able to strafe left to right. While not a major change, this is a really good addition, especially since this is a game that is a lot more aggressive with the types of enemies you have to go up against, along with the amount of enemies you'll be going up against. I mean, not to mention that you do have to deal with a lot of projectiles such as spears, arrows, grenades, and RPGs, just to name a few. There are times where enemies will even go for a lunge attack while you strafe, and strafing doesn't necessarily always guarantee that you'll be able to dodge those lunging attacks, but it does mean that you do have a viable approach to dodging when a dodge QTE doesn't pop up because you happen to be out of that trigger range for that QTE to be pulled off. This, of course, just happens to vary based on the type of enemies that you're going up against. Speaking of QTs, those have been expanded upon as well. You now have follow-up QT attacks which come in handy for tougher enemies that might require some more work. They can also be followed up in some instances, and this could be really effective for stun locking certain enemies with a competent co-op partner. On top of that, there's QT finishers for downed enemies. The finishers don't always work in your favor since some enemies can still take the hit, and in some instances they will have a Plagas pop right out. However, this should be relatively easy to deal with if and when your partner is near you. You can also help out your partner via a QT attack when they're grabbed, which I think is really convenient. I guess Capcom must have taken a look at Resident Evil 4 and saw how flawed it is to have a defenseless character by your side that could instantly die if shot by accident. Thankfully, shooting your partner isn't really going to do anything unless if you enable friendly fire. Obviously, I don't want to gloss over this aspect, but there is a bit of a caveat to having a partner in this game. So unlike in Resident Evil 4 where the whole game was nothing more than a giant escort mission, 5 sees the return of a feature that was first introduced in Resident Evil 0 via having a partner. The mechanics differ of course, given the fact that you cannot swap between characters on the fly, but the reliability of having a second character with extra item slots, commands to give, and usefulness as a dedicated medic is a good thing. Is what I would have said if the AI for Sheva wasn't so bad. I've played between the PS3, PS4, and PC versions of the game, and in my experience, Sheva's AI seems to be in its worst via the PS4 version. I've literally had times where the AI would run the other direction when I needed to be healed or requested an ammo exchange. It's actually kind of sad when I have to compare this AI to some AI that came out in 2002 via a previous Resident Evil title. So honestly, if there's any way that I would recommend playing the main game, it's with a living human being. Just whatever you do, play with an actual person via couch co-op or through online co-op. Either way, that is just the only way I can recommend playing this game. Do not play with the AI, especially on harder difficulties, because once you crank up the difficulty, that's where it becomes an utter mess. Moving on to some other aspects of the game, let's talk about weapons first. There's a lot of weapons compared to the previous games, and it's a whole arsenal's worth, plus a few exclusive weapons that are only found on certain characters in Mercenaries mode. On the one hand, it's actually really nice to have a ton of weapons because it means a lot of variety, but on the other hand, it's also very telling that this is yet another title within the franchise that had abandoned the survival horror in favor of all-out action. At least in the context of this game, I would say my only gripe with it is that we lost custom weapon parts from 2, 3, and 4, but I guess the amount of weapons somewhat justifies that loss. There is also another thing that slightly puzzles me as far as losses are concerned, and that's the way that the health items have been reworked. So while in Resident Evil 4, we lost blue herbs and poison status in favor of yellow herbs that upgrade your health, this game just seems to throw away the yellow herbs and remove the ability to combine 3 herbs together. Sure, you could argue that in most cases, previous games, you would probably never really want to combine all 3 herbs. You would save that third one for a red herb or a blue herb, or in the case of 4, a yellow herb. But this was just an option that just happened to be present since the very original, so I don't necessarily understand why they removed it. I guess what puzzles me about that is that there were several titles that preceded this one, and for some reason they decided to change something that didn't really need to be changed. Then again, I guess you could say some of the other changes to health weren't so bad. For example, dying state now puts you on a timer, and if said timer runs out, then it's game over, unless your partner comes in to stop that or heals you just outright. Also, as mentioned earlier, there's no yellow herbs, so you don't need to upgrade your health or your AI companions for that matter. And in addition to this, body armor has been altered to cover both melee and projectile based damage, with 2 separate sets of armor that take up inventory space. And since this is a Resident Evil game, because this series is notorious for limited inventory space, I think I should delve into that just a bit as well. So rather than having a suitcase that you can expand over time to fit in ammo and weapons, Resident Evil 5 actually limits you to 9 total slots for your inventory. To top it off, Unlike the previous games, checking your inventory leaves you in a vulnerable state because enemies can attack you while you're checking your inventory. So choose wisely when the best time is to actually check your inventory. This is actually more in lines with what came before Resident Evil 4, and I mean more so in the fact that inventory was roughly about 6 to 10 spaces total. Honestly, I actually find myself preferring this setup over what was in Resident Evil 4, and I think that's just mostly because of the fact that I feel as though this very much would work for a survival horror game within this franchise. Putting the players more at risk for checking inventory and really limiting how much the player can carry at once. In a way, it kind of makes it similar to Resident Evil 0, where you do have to rely on your partner in that sense, but also with limited inventory. The last notable change, while minor in this regards, is to the map. Resident Evil 4 had maps ready for you in the menu options, with really the only other maps you acquire outside of that are through treasure maps that you purchased from the merchant. Resident Evil 5 instead opts to forgo the treasure maps and having to look through menus in favor of a live map that's fixated to your HUD. Personally, I have never found myself ever really in need of maps within the franchise, especially in the case of 5, because of how linear the game is. Although I can see where it could be useful to just know the general layout of some of the locations, where it could be useful for new players to the game or just players that like that general sense of a layout for the locations that they're in. If you're like me though and found that the map is of no use, you do thankfully have the ability to just turn off the map. Additionally, if you happen to be separated from your partner, you're able to hold on to one of the trigger buttons, and this would highlight your partner and show off their location both on the map as well as from your point of view, which could be very convenient in certain cases where you need to take time to scavenge for resources and treasures. As I've mentioned before, however, this game is very linear, so I don't think you'll really be in need of it, but it is there. And that's pretty much all there is to talk about as far as gameplay and additional features are concerned. Although with that out of the way, it leads us into talking about DLC, post-game content, as well as the quality of the PC version. We'll be talking about the PC version first, then talking about the DLC, as well as the post-game content. Specifically, the DLC I'm saving for later because of the fact that RE5 did have some changes made on the current gen hardware for post-game content, so I think it's best that we save that for later. Also, before we move on to the PC version and DLC, I'd like to introduce you all to my friend KaptainKaos. This is the first time I collaborate with somebody on a review, and just to clarify, our opinions may differ on the game, especially when it comes to the DLC, but I wanted to do it this way because I wanted to give another perspective on the game, especially from somebody who had never beaten the game before prior to this review. But that's enough of my ramblings. Please give a warm welcome to KaptainKaos.
What's going on, everyone? I know Dom has already covered the game itself in detail, so I'm just here to cover the quality of the PC port along with the DLC. For PC port, Resident Evil 5 is mostly without issue and functions well enough. Many of the problems with the port were at the game's launch with the intrusive Games for Windows Live. However, since that terrible service no longer exists, the port is now better off for it. The game runs at up to 120Hz and is locked at that frame rate if you have a monitor with a high refresh rate like mine. I found that trying to get this game to work with mods like the True Color mod that removes the obnoxious filter from the game is a major hassle, at least for me. No matter what I've tried, I can't seem to get this particular mod to work properly. It should be as simple as extracting the files from the mod into the game folder, but it never seems to work. Even reinstalling the game will not get the mod to work for me. Dom has had similar issues with the mod. For whatever reason, the only thing that seems to make it work is playing the game in windowed mode. Call me stubborn, but I refuse to do that just so I can get this mod working properly. Most people don't seem to have an issue with this mod, so I'm guessing I'm an anomaly in this case. Something that did happen after trying to get this mod working with the game was the game crashing every time I would alt-tab out. As you might imagine, this made some of our co-op sessions pretty frustrating if I happened to do this by accident or something happened in the background that caused the game to minimize.
For anyone that wants to play the game via co-op on PC, I'll leave a link down in the description for the mod. Also, I did try the True Color mod on my old PC, and while I was having the same issue of full screen not being able to work, you can technically use a workaround via a full screen tool. But that being said, for those that are interested in that mod, this is what the game looks like with no filter on.
Gameplay-wise, Resident Evil 5 is more or less the same as Resident Evil 4, with one of the main gameplay changes being the cooperative mode or playing with the AI Sheva. The game for me is a bit of a step up from Resident Evil 4 in terms of its gameplay. However, if you're playing the game solo instead of co-op, you may run into some issues with the AI Sheva, as she's known to bug out sometimes and do generally stupid things that can get the both of you killed. In terms of enemy type, the enemies are pretty simple early on in the game. Much like Resident Evil 4, they will walk slowly towards you and try to bite you. Of course, later on the enemy types you go up against become tougher and arguably more annoying. There are quite a few bullet sponge enemies that can deal a lot of damage. This does make certain segments more tense, but also irritating. It goes without saying, if you have someone playing co-op with you, it makes some of the levels where you go up against these enemies much less annoying. Dom and I did have some issues with certain bosses as well, such as Ouroboros 2, and at the very end of the game where you fight Wesker.
Yeah, I'm not particularly sure if this is something that impacts the PC version specifically, but there were times where we weren't sure if the bosses could be killed. The second Ouroboros fight in particular seemed to drag on for much longer than usual, and I can't really explain why.
Both times when this happened, both of us ended up saying screw it, and Dom purchased a rocket launcher in order to kill the boss almost immediately. This ended up solving these issues in a way. The rocket launcher in these moments felt a bit like a crutch. It's basically a get out of jail free card if you're having trouble with these bosses. It is a bit cheap, but what else can you do when you have issues where a boss won't die, or there's a QTE segment that won't work for you? Speaking of which, the QTE segments can be a bit finicky at times when it comes to functionality. They seem to work when they want to sometimes, and when they don't, it can be incredibly frustrating depending on how far one can set you back. In particular, the final segment when fighting Wesker, Sheva ends up falling and hanging from a ledge. You basically need to murder buttons or else she'll fall. Even when doing this, nothing seemed to work. We tried this multiple times until eventually using the rocket launcher. We don't usually make that decision lightly though.
When I played the game with our friend DevilHunterJames on the PS4 version, this sort of occurred, but he managed to complete the QTE after the 6th try or so. I did a bit of research on the issue, and it seems as though on the PC version it happens quite frequently, so most people resort to the rocket launcher to resolve the issue. Also, something else to keep in mind is that myself and Kaos were playing on veteran difficulty with a fresh save on PC, so we did not have access to fully upgraded weapons, nor did we have access to infinite ammo, which could be used as an alternative to defeat pretty much every single boss in this game. So that said, the rocket launcher is more or less the only other alternative you have on a fresh save. Otherwise, infinite ammo and fully upgraded weapons should do the trick.
In the Lost in Nightmares DLC, Chris and Jill investigate the Spencer Manor. It basically goes over how Jill died, quote unquote, and was separated from Chris. This is something that's brought up quite a bit in the main game, so this DLC is there to fill the gap and give more context to why Jill is doing what she's doing in the main game. They're trying to apprehend Oswell E. Spencer and end up running into Albert Wesker. Wesker arrived moments before Chris and Jill, killing Spencer's guards and killing Spencer himself as they get to him. A fight ensues and Jill tries to sacrifice herself to save Chris. The gameplay for this is a little bit different from the main game. In the DLC, you're solving more puzzles and end up running away from enemies more. The only enemies you go up against in this DLC are the blobs, which are basically reskinned executioners. There are zombies on the ground that will grab you from time to time, but I'm not really counting them. There are also different weapons you get depending on your playthrough. There's also a segment where you're left with nothing but flash grenades in a dungeon and have to lure the blobs into a trap. This is probably the only segment in this DLC that felt tense and more like one of the older games. It felt like they were trying to replicate that feeling in this DLC with the mansion and the callbacks to the older games, but for the most part it just didn't feel like an old school Resident Evil game in that sense.
For myself personally, I really enjoy going through the Lost in Nightmares DLC chapter, despite some glaring issues such as lack of enemy variety and overall length of the DLC. I felt as though, while it isn't exactly like an old school Resident Evil game, it did feel, in my opinion, closer to what Resident Evil 5 should be like. I know that sounds strange given the fact that I was just praising the main game for being a fun action game that I happen to prefer over Resident Evil 4, but honestly I would have preferred the game in this sort of tone and style. Those of you who are more familiar with Resident Evil's development history might also be aware of the fact that some of the locales featured in Lost in Nightmares are more reminiscent to the scrapped versions of Resident Evil 4. So in that kind of sense, I really wish they would have revived those old concepts from Resident Evil 3.5 for something really interesting. Aside from that, the only thing I really wish they could have did was just make it a longer experience. That being said, let's get into the Desperate Escape DLC.
Desperate Escape is the next Resident Evil 5 DLC. It follows Josh and Jill right after you fight her in the main game. It explains how Jill and and Josh were able to pick up Chris and Sheva in the helicopter after the Wesker fight at the very end of the game. Much unlike Lost in Nightmares, Desperate Escape throws a ton of enemies at you. The gameplay mainly consists of going from point A to point B and clearing an obstacle that might be in your way of getting there. There's also a horde mode at the very end where you have to hold out until the helicopter reaches you. This is probably the most tense segment of the DLC. If you don't have a good strategy here, you can easily die. It's pretty easy to get separated from your partner during this part of the DLC if you're not careful. It's usually best to stick together then go off somewhere, mainly because of how easy it is to get cornered. This DLC is actually longer than the Lost in Nightmares DLC, mostly because there's more fighting and general hindrances to your progression. I would say out of the two DLCs Resident Evil 5 has to offer, I actually enjoyed this one the most despite the few annoyances I have with it near the beginning. If you're playing this with a friend, it's very fun, but I can't really speak for the solo experience.
I'm not gonna lie, I generally don't care for Desperate Escape only because there's some really dumb moments, especially on veteran and professional difficulties, and you can expect a lot of explosives as well as unavoidable deaths. Kaos made a really good point about being separated too. While it can be very easy to be separated, there are times where the DLC makes it mandatory. Also, much like the Lost in Nightmares DLC, most of the weapons that you pick up are random, so you can end up picking up something that could really make the run go smoother, or something that you might not have a strong suit for or need for a majority of the playthrough. Although with that in mind, I do think that some people will like this sort of adrenaline rush type of DLC where you're constantly on your feet and you have to think about every action to progress further into the DLC.
I would say Resident Evil 5 is an enjoyable experience overall. If you like Resident Evil 4, I don't think you'll find much to complain about here aside from Sheva's AI if you play the game solo, and some annoyances with the aforementioned game mechanics. If you're someone who's a bigger fan of the older survival horror-oriented Resident Evil games, then this might not be for you, but it's worth checking out regardless. The PC port is probably the best way to play it, especially if you can get the true color mod to work. Your results may vary on that since both Dom and myself had issues getting it to work properly. I hope you guys found my section of this review to at least be somewhat informative if you're thinking about picking up a PC port. Now I'll hand it back over to Dom. This is KaptainKaos signing off.
Thanks a ton for joining me in this review, Chaos. Alrighty, before I get into my personal recommendations for Resident Evil 5, I wanted to cover some of the post-game content. So aside from the DLC chapters, we obviously just need to cover the few extra game modes, alternative costumes, and some figurines. So let's get the most boring one out of the way, figurines. These are just little collectibles that you can unlock by using the in-game points you earn for just playing the game. The figures range from enemy types to characters. There's nothing really special except for one Jill figure variant, which I will not show the specific detail for, but there's a little something about it that made players discover an uncovered part of the model, and it also doesn't help that said uncovered part is also noticeable in cutscenes too. I'll leave that one up for the imagination, but let's move on. There's 4 DLC costumes and 4 unlockable costumes. The unlockable costumes either require you to beat the game or to shoot down all 30 BSAA emblems. The BSAA emblems are similar to the blue medallions found in Resident Evil 4, but instead of unlocking a free gun that's slightly upgraded, you just get costumes. Emblems are generally scattered in various locations and in some cases are put out very far out within a location, and I gotta admit that these were pretty surprising to just find because I wouldn't have considered looking in some of the areas that they were placed in. And then of course we have the extra game modes. Mercenaries is pretty straightforward. If you've played Resident Evil 4, it's essentially the same thing, but there's more maps, characters, and depending on the version that you might play, you might notice something called Mercenaries Reunion or Mercenaries United. To break this down into simpler terms, Mercenaries Reunion is a version of Mercenaries that has all the DLC costumes for Chris and Sheva, plus a few new characters that are playable in this version, such as Rebecca Chambers and Barry Burton. This version of Mercenaries is available on Resident Evil 5 Gold Edition for the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC. Mercenaries United, on the other hand, is a version of Mercenaries that is, at the time of this recording, only exclusive to the console versions via PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch, and is essentially a combination of the original Mercenaries and Reunion. So if you have a character that you like to main that was only only available in the original Mercenaries mode, but you have a partner that prefers to main a character from Reunion, you won't have to switch between the two modes on console at least. Although I'm pretty sure on PC there might be a mod floating around there somewhere that allows you to play as both characters without having to switch between the game modes. However, there's one mode that PC did have prior, and that is Mercenaries No Mercy. No Mercy essentially had you going up against twice as many enemies at once. This mode is a single player mode, but if I'm not mistaken, there is a mod for co-op No Mercy. On console, this was added to the recent ports of the games, and it's also just based on Mercenaries United. So if you want to start maining Heavy Metal Chris and just go through enemies like a hot knife through butter, well, you can through this game mode. Lastly, we have competitive modes: Survivors, Slayers, Team Survivors, and Team Slayers. Now, I do have to admit that my experience with competitive Resident Evil modes really goes about as far as Operation Raccoon City being the most that I've experienced, while Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, and Umbrella Corps being the least amount of competitiveness I've experienced within Resident Evil. So forgive me if I might not be the most well-versed in this particular subject for this game. That being said, however, these modes are part of Resident Evil 5's Versus. Survival is essentially a free-for-all deathmatch, and Team Survivors is a 2v2 team deathmatch. While you do have enemies in your way, your primary focus is to eliminate the other players that you're going up against. From my understanding, you earn points for defeating BOWs on the stage, along with dealing damage to your opponents. However, you earn the most points for actually eliminating opponents before they can recover and fight back. So it's pretty straightforward. Just kill all the other players that get in your way and kill any BOWs that might get in your way as well. And then that also brings us to Slayers and Team Slayers. The best way that I can describe this mode is that it's competitive Mercenaries. Everyone in this mode only starts off with one gun and has to fight to get other guns, earn more points, and eliminate other players. There's a bit of a catch to the weapons though in this mode. Anyone that's defeated will lose their most recently obtained weapon. So if you were eliminated early on in the round before obtaining your second weapon, you're practically just going to be left with a knife. That's slightly altered in Team Slayers, where the player will drop their weapon on the ground, leaving it open for either a teammate or the enemy team to obtain it to use it for or against you. I'm not really big on competitive Resident Evil, as mentioned earlier. However, I do think that in a private match with some friends, where you can set up some private match rules and restrictions, it could be quite fun. And that's pretty much everything that Resident Evil 5 has to offer. So do I think it's worth picking up? Absolutely. As mentioned earlier in the video, when I was younger, I had a much more negative impression of the game. Of course, with age and experience, I've come to appreciate the game a lot more. The story is something that I realize is far more grounded into what the series is actually about prior to Resident Evil 4, and the gameplay is a hefty improvement over its predecessor. Also, depending on the version of the game, there's a substantial amount of content to get invested into, such as the DLC chapters, Mercenaries, and Versus. There's several different ways to play Resident Evil 5, and I guess it just happens to be coincidence that right about the time that I finished this review, or around the time that I finished this review, the Switch port should be out, or should be coming out, something along the nature, if it's not out already. The point being is that the Switch version should be around the corner, so it makes sense to release the review, and it's somewhat addressing that for anybody who might not have played this game and might be interested in picking it up on the Switch. But that being said, I would say go for the Gold Edition, unless if you're looking to buy the Collector's Edition with some goodies, if you are considering going for the previous gen version on 360 and PS3, because the Standard Edition and Gold Editions are available there. On PC, Gold Edition technically isn't a thing, it's just referred to as Resident Evil 5. However, when purchasing the game on Steam, you're going to want to go for the Untold Stories bundle, which bundles the Lost in Nightmares and Desperate Escape DLC chapters. I'm also kind of surprised that Capcom never released an updated PC port that has no ties to games for Windows Live. It's also kind of strange to think that with the recent console ports having slightly updated content, you'd think that they'd go out of their way to maybe re-release that for the PC, as well as some maybe higher quality textures and lighting. That and the addition to fixes to co-op would be pretty nice to have. Now, I don't mean to harp on the PC port or sound like this port of the game isn't worth purchasing. It's just that some of these things I think personally would have been nice to see addressed in an updated port if it were to ever come out. That said though, once you get that fan patch to fix the co-op, this is a great way to experience the game, especially if you intend on modding the game even further. Then of course, lastly, we have the most recent ports of Resident Evil 5, and while they are based on the Gold Edition, this version of Resident Evil 5 drops that subtitle. This port also makes some small updates to Mercenaries by combining Mercenaries and Mercenaries Reunion. Also, much like other HD ports of this generation, this port of Resident Evil 5 boasts 1080p and 60 FPS. It's available for PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. Generally speaking, Resident Evil 5 is fairly cheap to get a hold of regardless of platform. The only platform it will be $60 for is on Switch, but in its defense, it does come bundled with Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 6. It can be purchased, however, for $39.99 on its own. Otherwise, on average, it varies for about $20, so you really can't go wrong with picking up any version of this game. With that all being said, I hope you all enjoyed the review. I also want to give a huge thanks to everyone involved with helping me out recording the gameplay footage. Without their help, I don't think this review would have turned out as well as it did. This is probably one of the biggest reviews I've done so far for the channel, right next to the Onimusha review, and I hope to keep the quality of these about the same, if not even better quality in the future. Of course, there's more to come from this video project series that's way past overdue completion, and I think it's about time we talk about the game that I find to be my personal favorite within the series. But until then, I'll see you all in the next one. Matane.